Pierre and I discuss this idea often that the modern concept of the human that emerges in the 17th century is basically grounded in two differentiations. On the one hand, humans are said to be more than nature, meaning more than animals or plants, or rocks and rivers and so on, ontologically different from them, but they're also ontologically different from machines. So the human has these two boundaries, more than nature, other than machines. And there is a specific discourse that is entirely comprehensible that basically defines nature as good, as the baseline, as the original, as that which is damaged now, and technology definitely as bad because it's the anti-natural, and humans sort of as bad, at least in their form of human exceptionalism. The idea was, and in that sense, you would have ontologized this modern concept of nature as the out there, the space that we go into on Sunday afternoon and then come back home and feel so much better. And so undifferentiation was the idea that there is no baseline. We undifferentiate humans from nature, but also nature from humans, and also technology from nature, but also nature from technology, and also humans from technology and technology from humans. So no baseline, a radical nothing in the middle, so to speak, is that outside, that radical outside, that this figure, I don't want to call it human because precisely it's not human, right? It might become human, but we don't know what that means. So it's like this outside. And what if that outside were the equivalent to this no baseline state? Just nothing there yet. No ontological categories of any kind, right? No time, no space, no causality, no human, no nature, no technology, nothing. We know that there are many languages that don't have a word for being. It's a peculiar Western sort of conception that makes the world knowable and experiential in a certain way. But for example, in traditional, actually almost, I was going to say in traditional Chinese and Japanese philosophy, it's not known, but most non-Western languages don't have a word for being. What an outside is cannot always be the same thing. If the outside of untilled and the outside of afterlife ahead and the outside of variance or the outside of liminals would always be the same, we would have ontologized the outside, right? So what the outside is has to be specific. It has to be always new and different. And one way to get to that specificity is that you do not assume that there is a stable outside, but that outside means outside of specific concepts that we have at the given time. Concepts constitute us and our world. They produce us in a certain way. They make the world experiential and make us experiential to ourselves. They structure how we think. And so you want to examine these concepts and let them go. And so you have to focus on the untenability of these concepts, on their edges, and dissolve them there. I think that there is a philosophical history to this, right? So the first philosopher, at least to my knowledge, that made world into a concept, a philosophically important concept, was Kant. And he basically had read Hume. And David Hume says, well, all of our experiences are really completely individual experiences. We somehow magically think that they're connected into a bigger whole, but there is no bigger whole. And so it's actually all random and dispersed. And Kant says, no, there is actually something there, precisely because we experience things as related, as happening in a sort of broader context. Maybe there is a kind of a priori that holds all of this together, and maybe that is world. And then he has this very specific claim: only humans have world. Heidegger later picked this up basically by saying, stones are basically part of the world and animals move through the world, but only humans have world, and so on. And in the 1990s, early 2000s, well, it's too early, late 2000s, early 2010s, people like Anat Singh began using the word world making for mushrooms and how mushrooms make world. So there a specific discourse developed about non-human world making, but it was actually using a deeply human exceptionalist vocabulary applied to non-humans, but never rethought really. So it was as if we radically humanize everything by granting them to make worlds just as humans do. And so let me call this the total ontologization of the human, basically, right? But there is this other project that we thought is very important, and that is unworlding. Basically, getting outside of these concepts, moving into an outside. How do you do this? And undifferentiation in that sense is unworlding, is creating always new and different outsides. So, in a very traditional, very conservative philosophical setting, there is a distinction between reality and world. And basically, world is reality that we can experience, while reality is beyond human capabilities. Let's assume reality is not. Today, we organize reality into categories of things, right? So, human things, natural things, technical things. And in the natural world, there are plants, there are animals, and so on. So, we clearly have categories to which we assign things. And almost always, the category to which a thing belongs determines what capabilities or qualities that thing has. So, the categories are pretty strict ontological little prisons, basically, right? The categories are time and place dependent. They're contingent. They could be otherwise. And they have, over the course of time, been many other categories, and they make the world, they make reality differently experiential. So different worlds, one reality. Does that mean that you believe reality is like the real thing that we can measure? No, that's not what I said. Reality would basically be a diffuse thing. And each time we get to experience it, we have already conceptualized it. Concepts constitute it as something that we can experience. And reality will always be bigger than that. If I think from that perspective, I don't think Pierre's works produce reality, but they release us into, and you can call this reality if you want to, they release us into an outside beyond our worlds, so to speak, right? You could almost say they put us in the real, for which we never have concepts. And the most radical version of this is liminals, um, in the sense that it's an outside that is so radically outside that there are absolutely no ontological categories whatsoever. It's beyond time and space. It's beyond the distinction of living and non-living, beyond the distinction of being and thing. Humans don't exist as a category. And there's this figure, sometimes seeming to find itself and emerge as something in order to collapse back into a stone among stones, basically, right? It's right before the myth. It's right at the intersection of what we would call traditionally chaos and cosmos. It's like in the liminal space right in there. So I think when Pierre says myth, when he says cosmos, he wants to indicate, in my vocabulary that he would never use, the sort of field of inquiry in which this artwork is located. What vocabulary do we have available to enter a world before ontological categories, before the certainty of ontological categories? Well, then you end up with the vocabulary of myth, very specific sort of non-science-based, non-humanist-based possibility of creating an opening, a possibility. So it's just interesting that we have a very limited vocabulary, and that Pierre is, I think, visibly struggling with this, and I find that struggle quite beautiful. In my own work, I often wonder how to be human or live a human life after the modern category of the human. And when I first saw liminals, I thought that's sort of about how to be human before the category human exists and before we have any sense of self. And we emerge or this figure emerges as a possibility, but then collapses again and there is nothing stable. I can say it's really the radical undifferentiation of the human from the real understood as that which is outside of any concept, but that can always only be accessed through the rupture of specific concepts and therefore is always different. And in parallel, I can say it's actually us, or it's the figure of the human, or this human-like figure that is not human, is while we watch it, producing you and me as spectators in terms of that outside. It produces us, constitutes us, makes us experiential in the non-terms of that outside. And so the same collapse, not the same, but a similar but different collapse that that figure that is not human happens in us simply by virtue of watching. Like empathy in that sense is the impulse, but doesn't work because you cannot extend the human sentiment to this figure that looks like a human but is not. I do think that quantum has been an important reference, like really an important reference for Pierre in producing this work. But not quantum qua science. I don't think that he has an allegiance to that. Not that to the best of my knowledge, he's not against science or something like that. But he operates in a very different genre, a very different kind of field. Truth is not his business, so to speak. At least not scientific truth. And so the the question always is, does an artist exemplify the power and the might of quantum computers? Does an artist aestheticize or give artistic dignity to science and so on? None of this interests Pierre, and of course his work is not about quantum. If it had an aboutness, the whole work would basically fail, like at least in his own view, I think. But so what is quantum? Well, quantum is really interesting as a conceptual field. Sometimes I like to say quantum is not interesting as a scientific breakthrough, but as a complete breakdown of the vocabulary that we have, right? So a world where there is no causality, right? This is really confusing. There is no locality. Things have no clear boundaries. Nothing is discrete and set apart. And so quantum is really like intriguing conceptually because it releases you into a non-world, a non-world where the entire vocabulary we have fails. So is quantum an allegory for Pierre? Is it a metaphor? No, I don't think so. I think it's just really provocative as a conceptual outside, as a breakdown. And in that sense, it can be useful to engage and think with. And so, yes, I think the best way for me to think about this is quantum offers a defiance, a sort of evocative sense of what an outside could be that is maybe more radical than any other sort of effort to think and articulate an outside that we know. But it's interesting not because of its truthfulness. It's interesting not because one can build more powerful machines. It's merely interesting as a poetic experience that one can work with.